As college students, we can be known for being a little stingy with our money. It's understandable because we're using our money and sometimes our parents' money to pay for a lot of things right now. Tuition, books, and transportation are all necessary for us right now. But with places like Jefferson's, Buffalo Wild Wings, and my personal favorite, Fuzzy's, which aren't too far away from us, it can be tempting to want to go out to eat maybe once or twice or maybe 4 times a week instead of having that third cup of Easy Mac for dinner. Um, I will acknowledge that eating out is a splurge, but getting the check and being reminded that I must leave a tip always gets to me. I always wonder if what I'm leaving is enough and who my tip is actually going to. The tipping culture has been around since the late 19th century, and with minimum wage being an issue in our society today, tipping has become unfair to all parties involved. Today, I'd like to talk to you about first, the history of tipping and why it's become a custom in America. Second, why the tipping practice is unfair and wrong. And finally, how the messing tipping situation can be fixed. I'll begin by telling you about where tipping came from. Tipping is a practice that was brought to America by travelers returning from Europe. According to Michael Lynn, a professor at the Cornell University of Hotel Administration, tipping in the United States begun just after the American Civil War in the late 1800s. Lynn suggests that wealthy Americans traveling abroad to Europe witnessed tipping there and brought it back with them to show off how rich and how awesome they were for traveling, and they wanted to show off how cultured they were. And they wanted to show off their elevated education and their class. Tip actually stands for the term to ensure promptitude, and it's been said to have been originated in taverns in England by customers who wanted their drinks brought to them quickly. And I learned this on a restaurant blog called foodwolf.com. Tipping wasn't widely accepted when it was brought to America. Many Americans were upset that the tipping had come from Europe. To quote William Scott in his 1916 anti-tipping article, he said, "Tipping in the aristocratic idea it exemplifies is what we left Europe to escape." People were upset because travelers brought back the tipping practice to demonstrate how cultured and rich they were, but aristocracy wasn't what America was all about. The irony about tipping is that almost every European country has abandoned that practice. According to the New York Times, the 1943 Catering Wages Act in Britain established a minimum wage for service employees that helped decrease the reliance on tips. And in 1955, France passed a law requiring its restaurants to add a service charge to each bill, a practice that has become the norm for most of the continent today. I remember when I traveled to Spain for one summer, I was relieved that I wasn't asked to give a tip when I dined out because I honestly didn't know what the appropriate tip was there, and I was kind of scared that they'd get mad at me, but I was relieved that it wasn't a thing there, and it was kind of weird, but different. With the growth of the tipping practice mixed with many issues with the topic of minimum wage, many problems have been aroused because of tipping in America. A discussion I listened to on NPR suggested that, according to one theory, when you get down to it, we don't tip because of the good service, we tip because we feel guilty. According to a 2000 study provided by Slate.com, a customer's assessment of the server's work only accounts for between 1 and 5% of the variation in tips that are given. Americans have a general amount that they always have in their head before they even sit down of what they're going to tip, no matter the service that they receive. There is always somewhat of an awkward moment between your group when you're determining a tip, and again, Professor Lynn describes it to be somewhat of a competition. To quote Benjamin Franklin in his stint in Paris about how much he hated tipping, he said, "To overtip is to appear as an ass, and to undertip is to become even more of an ass." The problem, also according to Slate.com with tipping, is that restaurants don't pay their employees a minimum wage that is suitable for living today in our society. The federal tip credit allows restaurants to pay their tipped employees as little as $2.13 per hour, as long as tips make up for the rest of the wage, which turns a customer into a co-employer. According to federal and state law, it requires restaurants to ensure that tips bring employees up a minimum wage. Few diners know that, though. There is no tip or credit in some states, like California and Washington, where tipped employees must be paid the full minimum wage, which is $7.25 right now. This creates a problem and an inconsistency for restaurants that have many locations in all 50 states. Some employees are getting paid the minimum wage and tips, while other employees who are doing the same exact job are getting paid at $2.13 an hour and therefore rely on tips to make it by. There are also some legal problems with restaurants requiring that all tips must be pooled together and split evenly between all the staff. This law regarding tip sharing and tip pooling, which occur in many restaurants, are even more complicated than tipping itself. Federal law allows mandatory tip sharing, but only among employees who customarily receive either direct or indirect tips. This means that servers, bussers, food runners, and hosts and hostesses can be required to pool their tips with each other, but not with managers. But there is a fine line between management and servers, and it's unclear in many restaurants. The differences between state laws further complicate the matter even more. Both Starbucks and Chili's have lost millions of dollars in lawsuits because of unfair tip sharing, according to Slate.com again. So they pooled together their sharings, and the managers got a portion of it, even though they don't get paid $2.13 an hour. They get paid even more than the minimum wage, but they thought that they deserved some of the tips. Again, according to Professor Lin from Cornell, in his studies, he's concluded that tipping is discriminatory. In his research, he found that people who got the most tips were slender, white women in their 30s with large breasts, and an Aspen Institute study suggests that nearly 40% of restaurant workers earn at or below the federal minimum wage of $7.25, even with factor tips in. This can be supported by a MarketWatch.com survey, which says that 75% of Americans say that they tip less than the customary 20% when dining out. Additionally, they report that 46 Americans say that they are tipping less in general than they did 5 years ago. So even with the $2.13, the tips aren't making up for servers' wages, and they can't live off that easily. As we can see, there are many inconsistencies and unfair practices of the tipping practice, and it seems like there's no possible way to easily regulate it. Many people have proposed eliminating the tipping practice completely. There hasn't been a solid solution that can easily solve everything that's wrong with the tipping practice, but many people have tried to critique it. A restaurant in San Diego called The Lingerie abolished tipping completely in their business. They adopted a policy of adding to each dining-in check a service charge of 18%, so pretty much a gratuity that we experience when we have a big group of people. It's a little less than the average tip that they had been receiving already. They also refused to accept payment, like tips that were left in cash when people left, and if somebody did that, they donated it to a charity of the month that they got to pick, or they asked for suggestions of charities that they should donate the tips to. They did this so that 18% could be distributed evenly between cooks and servers. The owner reported that the service and the food had improved because everyone was being paid more. He said that the service improved principally because eliminating tips makes it easier to provide good service. He said that the servers weren't really worried about if they were going to make enough that day because they already were through the gratuity, so they just didn't have to worry about it. And the cooks were happy, and the food was better because they were getting paid just as much as the servers. Another restaurant owner named Scott Rosenberg, who owned a sushi restaurant in New York, he decided to make a no-tip restaurant, and he believed that diners are simply tired of the meal-ending ritual of grading a server and then doing the math based on that judgment. He said it was a waste of time and it was unnecessary. When Scott Rosenberg did away with tipping some months back, he raised menu prices by 15% to cover costs. So he did give his employees the regular $7.25 wage. He just upped the prices to do that. Many people would like to see the $2.13 minimum wage be raised to standard $7.25 an hour for all servers because the service salary has remained unchanged since 1991. That means that thanks to inflation over the last 23 years, $2.13 from 1991 is worth about $1.24 today, which is ridiculous. Unfortunately, the setbacks from raising the minimum wage for every server seem just as confusing as the tipping system that I've been talking about. Many owners say that they'd have to cut some employees cut shifts, and they'd have to raise food prices if they were going to raise wages for all their employees. Regardless of the pros and cons of the wage changes, Consumerist says that changes in the minimum wage debate will probably be put off for another year or until the next presidential election, because it's not something that everyone's worrying about as much as other things going on right now. And personally, the way I see it and why I'm so bothered by the tipping culture is that I feel like it's not my responsibility to make up for the wage gap between 213 and 725 for servers. I feel like that's up to their employer, and I'm not their employer. I'm just buying food, and I will pay for that food, but I don't want to have to pay. I don't want to be responsible for someone else's salary. Like, I consider myself a kid still, and I don't have that much money already. And everyone gets annoyed with me when I say that, because they say servers don't want to provide good service anymore if they aren't getting tipped. But I worked in retail for 3 years, and I think that involved just as much interaction between customers and myself as waitressing would, just minus the food part. And I didn't get tipped, and not that I thought that I would, because I got paid minimum wage, but if I was tipped and I had gotten my tips taken away, I wouldn't automatically just have a bad mood all the time, because they have to keep their jobs. Employers don't want waitresses in a bad mood all the time, and they have to keep their jobs. So in conclusion, as you can see, the tipping culture is an outdated practice that we might want to think revising or getting rid of in our country. Even though there isn't a solid solution, I've told you about the history of how tipping came about, the numerous inconsistencies and complications that tipping causes, and the possible solutions that solve this awkward issue that we go through every day. I'm sure some of you have worked in the food industry or know someone who has, and I'm not saying that servers are not deserving of tips and that they should not be tipped. I'm saying that they deserve at least minimum wage so that they can get by, and they should earn their money in a fair way that doesn't involve judgments and grading by us. Although there have been small approaches to fixing this tipping problem, I urge you all to start thinking differently about tipping and maybe start thinking of your own ways to solve the problems that I've informed you about. Thank you.